The emergency klaxon screamed across the bridge of the Kethmoran flagship, its piercing wail cutting through the controlled chaos of a command center under siege. Commander Zexai stood before the massive tactical display, his forearms moving with practiced precision across holographic controls that painted the space around them in shades of impending doom. "Status report," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 battles fought across the spiral arm. The bridge crew, a mixture of various alien species united under the Galactic Coalition banner, moved with desperate efficiency. "Sir, the Eternal Dominion fleet has broken through our outer perimeter," reported Lieutenant Vashta, her reptilian features twisted with barely contained fear. 17 dreadnoughts, each one the size of a small moon. "They're broadcasting the standard surrender demand." Zexai's mandibles clicked in what other species had learned to recognize as grim determination. In his millennium of military service, he had never once considered surrender as an option, even when facing impossible odds. But this was different. The Eternal Dominion wasn't just another enemy fleet, they were beings who had transcended normal existence, entities that had ruled the galaxy for over 50,000 years with power that bordered on the divine. The tactical display showed the approaching fleet in terrifying detail. Each Dominion vessel was a work of art and destruction, their hulls gleaming with energy that seemed to bend space itself. These weren't just ships, they were moving temples to the ego of beings who had conquered death itself and decided that made them gods. "Any word from the Coalition reinforcement fleets?" Zexai asked, though he already knew the answer from the expressions around him. "The Ulterian Second Fleet was destroyed 12 hours ago," Vashta replied, her voice hollow. "The Centauri Defense Force lasted 18 minutes against a single Dominion dreadnought. We're receiving scattered distress signals from across 3 sectors, but..." She paused, struggling with the words. "Sir, I don't think anyone else is coming." The bridge fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems and the distant rumble of the ship's massive engines. Zexai had fought in wars that spanned decades, had seen entire civilizations reduced to ash, but he had never faced an enemy that could simply wish his fleet out of existence. The Eternal Dominion possessed technology so advanced it was indistinguishable from magic, wielded by beings who had lived longer than most species had existed. "Sir," Communications Officer Thralak spoke up, his voice carrying an odd note of confusion. "We're receiving a transmission on Coalition emergency frequencies. It's from a human vessel." Every head on the bridge turned toward the communications station. Humans were legendary throughout the galaxy, though not for the reasons most species preferred. They were the only race in known history that had encountered the Eternal Dominion and refused to surrender. Not just once, but repeatedly. For the past 300 years, humanity had been fighting a guerrilla war against beings who considered themselves gods, and, somehow, impossibly, they were still fighting. "Put it through," Zexai ordered. The main screen flickered, and, suddenly, they were looking at a human face. The creature before them appeared young by human standards, though Zexai knew that human lifespans were short enough that this one had probably seen more combat than most veteran warriors of longer-lived species. The human's face bore scars that spoke of countless battles, and there was something in its eyes, a fire that burned with an intensity Zexai had never seen in any other species. "Coalition Fleet, this is Captain Sarah Chen of the human vessel Defiant. We've been monitoring your situation." "Captain," Zexai replied, stepping forward. "I am Commander Zexai of the Coalition Defense Force. With respect, this is not your fight. The Eternal Dominion has committed 17 dreadnoughts to this engagement. I suggest you withdraw while you still can." Something that might have been amusement flickered across the human's scarred features. "Commander, we've been fighting the Dominion for 3 centuries. This is exactly our fight." "You don't understand," Zexai insisted. "These aren't ordinary Dominion forces. The readings we're getting, these ships are being commanded by the hierarchs themselves. Living gods, Captain. Beings with power beyond comprehension." The human's expression didn't change. If anything, the fire in her eyes seemed to burn brighter. "Commander, let me tell you something about humans. We've been killing gods since before we learned to make fire. The only difference now is that we've got better weapons." Before Zexai could respond, the tactical display exploded with new contacts. Dozens of them, appearing as if from nowhere around the Dominion fleet. At first, he thought it was some kind of sensor malfunction. The signatures were too small, too fast, and moving in patterns that defied conventional physics. "What are those?" Lieutenant Vashta gasped, her scaled hands flying over her controls. That would be the human fleet, Captain Chen replied calmly. All ships, this is actual. Operation Godslayer is now in effect. Remember, these things bleed just like everything else once you hit them hard enough. The human vessels were unlike anything Zexai had ever seen. They were smaller than coalition ships, but they moved with a predatory grace that spoke of design philosophies focused purely on one thing, killing things much larger than themselves. They didn't approach the Dominion fleet, they swarmed it, like antibodies attacking an infection. Impossible, Zexai whispered. Their ships are a fraction of the size of Dominion dreadnoughts. They can't possibly. His words were cut off as the first human vessel made contact with a Dominion ship. Instead of the expected flash of destruction as the human craft was obliterated, something else happened. The smaller ship seemed to attach itself to the hull of the massive dreadnought, and, suddenly, energy readings from the Dominion vessel began fluctuating wildly. What are they doing? Vashta demanded. They're boarding. Chen's voice came through the calm with something that sounded suspiciously like satisfaction. Turns out even gods don't like it when you bring the fight to their living room. The tactical display descended into chaos as more human ships latched onto Dominion vessels. Energy signatures that had remained stable for millennia began spiking and dropping erratically. For the first time in recorded history, Dominion dreadnoughts were showing signs of actual damage. How? Zexai found himself asking. How are you doing this? Commander, Chen replied, her image flickering as her ship shuddered under weapon fire that could have vaporized a small planet. The thing about gods is that they've been gods for so long, they've forgotten what it feels like to be afraid. We're here to remind them. As if summoned by her words, the viewscreen filled with an image that made every non-human on the bridge take an involuntary step backward. One of the Dominion dreadnoughts was opening, its hull unfolding like a massive flower to reveal something that existed at the intersection of technology and divinity. The hierarch emerged from its ship like a living constellation, its form shifting between states of matter as if reality itself couldn't quite decide how to contain it. The entity was beautiful in the way that supernovas were beautiful, terrible, and magnificent and absolutely lethal. Energy danced around its form like captured lightning, and, when it spoke, its voice resonated across every frequency simultaneously. Insects, the hierarch's voice boomed across space itself, reaching into minds without need for technology. You dare to touch the divine? We have ruled this galaxy since before your species crawled from primordial ooze. Surrender now, and your death will be swift. The human response came not in words, but in action. A sleek human frigate, barely the size of the hierarch's personal shuttle, broke away from the swarm and accelerated directly toward the divine being. The ship's hull began to glow with an energy signature that made Zexai's sensors scream warnings. What are they doing? He demanded. That's suicide. No, Jen's voice came through the calm, quiet now but filled with something that made the hair on Zexai's arms stand up despite his lack of human physiology. That's Tuesday. The human ship struck the hierarch at a significant fraction of light speed. The explosion that followed lit up the entire system, a bloom of energy so intense that it temporarily overloaded the sensors on every ship within a light minute. When the glare faded, the space where the hierarch had been was empty except for rapidly expanding debris and the fading echo of something that might have been a scream. The bridge of Zexai's flagship was dead silent. In the space of seconds, they had just witnessed something that should have been impossible. A human crew, organic beings with lifespans measured in mere decades, had just killed something that had existed since before their civilization had discovered fire. Did they just? Vashta started, then stopped, unable to finish the thought. They did, Zexai confirmed, his voice filled with an awe he didn't fully understand. They actually did it. But the humans weren't done. Across the battlefield, the small human vessels continued their deadly dance with ships that dwarfed them. They moved like living things, flowing around weapon fire that could have sterilized planets, striking at weak points with surgical precision, and, when necessary, ramming their targets with the kind of desperate courage that other species reserved for their greatest heroes. All coalition vessels, Chen's voice came through the comm again, now backed by the sound of weapon fire and shouting voices, this is your moment. The gods are bleeding. Time to show them what mortals can do when they stop being afraid. Zexai looked around his bridge at faces filled with wonder and terror and something else, hope. For the first time in the engagement, his crew was looking at their instruments with something other than despair. The Dominion fleet, seemingly invincible just moments before, was showing damage. Real, quantifiable damage. All weapons, Zexai commanded, his voice carrying new strength.
Target the damaged dreadnought at bearing 27 Mark IV.
Let's see how immortal these things really are. The Coalition fleet opened fire with everything they had, their weapons finally finding purchase on Dominion shields that had been weakened by human sabotage. Energy beams that had previously been absorbed without effect now carved gouges in hulls that had never known damage. The tide of battle was turning, and it was all because a group of humans had looked at gods and decided they didn't like what they saw. As the battle raged around them, HFY found himself studying the humans with new eyes. He had heard the stories, of course everyone had. Humans were the species that had never surrendered to the Eternal Dominion, the ones who had spent 3 centuries fighting a war everyone said was unwinnable. But, hearing stories and seeing reality were very different things. These weren't the primitive savages that Dominion propaganda described. These weren't the desperate fanatics that even Coalition intelligence suggested. These were warriors who had looked at the fundamental nature of the universe and decided it needed improvement. They fought with a precision that spoke of centuries of experience, but, more than that, they fought with a joy that was somehow more terrifying than any weapon.
Commander, Thralek called out, we're receiving tactical data from the human fleet. They're sharing targeting information, weak point analysis, optimal attack vectors.
It's incredibly detailed. HFY studied the incoming data streams, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The humans had been fighting the Eternal Dominion for 300 years, and, in that time, they had apparently catalogued every weakness, every vulnerability, every flaw in technology that most species considered flawless. They had turned the study of killing gods into a science. How long have they been planning this, he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Sir, Vashta called out, her voice tight with excitement, the second Dominion dreadnought is showing critical damage.
Human boarding parties have reached its core systems.
On the tactical display, HFY watched as another impossibly ancient and powerful warship began to die. The humans moved through it like a virus, spreading destruction with surgical precision. They knew exactly where to strike, exactly what to target, exactly how to bring down something that should have been beyond the reach of mortal weapons. As the second hierarch emerged from its dying ship, HFY braced himself for another display of divine fury. Instead, he found himself watching something he had never expected to see, a god retreating. The entity took one look at the humans converging on its position and simply vanished, teleporting away rather than face the creatures that had already killed one of its kind.
The humans didn't pursue.
They had already moved on to their next target, flowing across the battlefield like a living weapon designed specifically for killing the unkillable. And, as HFY watched them work, he began to understand why the Eternal Dominion, despite all their power and immortality, had never been able to completely destroy humanity. It wasn't because humans were stronger or more advanced or more numerous. It was because they were absolutely, completely insane. They looked at gods and saw target practice. They stared immortality in the face and laughed. They had turned deicide into an art form, and they practiced it with the kind of enthusiasm that other species reserved for their favorite hobbies.
Commander, Chen's voice came through the comm again, we've cleared a path to the third dreadnought. Ready to follow us in?
HFY looked around his bridge one more time, seeing his crew in a new light. They were still afraid any sane being would be, but now that fear was mixed with something else. They were looking at their instruments with the eyes of warriors who had just learned that gods could die. All ships, he commanded, his voice carrying across the Coalition fleet, follow the humans. Today we learn what it means to fight alongside the only species in the galaxy that the gods still fear. As the Coalition fleet moved forward into battle, HFY found himself wondering what other impossible things he was about to witness.
If this was just the beginning of the engagement, what would the humans show him next?
He was about to find out. The Coalition fleet moved through space with a purpose that HFY had never felt before in his 1,000-year career. Around him, his bridge crew worked with an intensity born from witnessing the impossible, gods bleeding, immortals fleeing, and humans turning divine arrogance into tactical opportunity. The tactical display showed their progress toward the third Dominion dreadnought, but HFY's attention was fixed on the human vessels that danced through the void ahead of them. Sir, Lieutenant Vashta called out, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and disbelief, the human fleet is transmitting something.
It appears to be music?
The bridge speakers crackled to life with a sound unlike anything in the Coalition database. Human music was legendary throughout the galaxy, though most species found it incomprehensible. Where other cultures created harmonies that celebrated peace and contemplation, humans apparently made sounds that could drive organic beings into battle frenzy. The rhythmic pounding that filled the bridge was primal, aggressive, and somehow perfectly suited to the carnage unfolding around them.
They're playing music during a battle against gods? Frolak asked, his tentacles writhing in confusion. Not just any music, Zexhai realized as he watched the human formation tighten in perfect synchronization with the beat. Battle music. They're coordinating their movements to it.
As if to prove his point, the human fleet suddenly shifted formation, their ships moving in perfect harmony with the driving rhythm. What had looked like chaos resolved into an intricate dance, with each vessel playing its part in a larger symphony of destruction. They approached the Third Dominion dreadnought not as individual ships, but as a single, living weapon that happened to be composed of several dozen parts. The hierarch commanding the dreadnought emerged to meet them, its form magnificent and terrible against the starfield. Unlike its retreating colleague, this entity chose to stand and fight. Energy cascaded around its divine form as it began to weave reality itself into weapons, bending space and time with casual gestures that spoke of power accumulated over millennia.
All vessels, maintain distance, Zexhai ordered his fleet.
We're not equipped to engage a hierarch directly.
But the humans had different ideas. Instead of maintaining a respectful distance from the reality-warping deity, they accelerated toward it.
Their ships began to glow with energy signatures that made Zexhai's sensors emit warning chimes, and their formation shifted again, this time into something that looked almost ritualistic.
What are they doing?
Vashta demanded, her scales rippling with nervousness. Captain Shen's voice came through the calm, calmer than any mortal being had a right to sound when facing divinity.
Commander, you're about to see something special. Humans have a saying, the bigger they are, the harder they fall.
We've been testing that theory for 3 centuries now.
The lead human vessel suddenly split open along its central hull, revealing something that made every non-human on the bridge recoil instinctively.
It wasn't technology, at least not in any conventional sense. The device that emerged from the ship's belly looked like it had been grown rather than built, its surface covered in patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly.
Biological technology? Zexhai whispered. The humans are using biological weapons against the Eternal Dominion?
Not biological, Chen corrected, her voice carrying a note of dark satisfaction.
Psychological.
The device activated with a pulse that registered on sensors throughout the system. Every ship, every station, every artificial intelligence capable of thought suddenly found itself experiencing something unprecedented. It was music, but not the rhythmic battle hymns the humans had been broadcasting earlier. This was something deeper, more fundamental, the sound of mortality itself. The hierarch's perfect form suddenly flickered, its divine composure wavering as the weapon struck not at its physical manifestation, but at its consciousness. For beings who had spent 50,000 years believing themselves to be gods, the reminder of their own fundamental mortality was devastating. Impossible, the entity's voice boomed across the battlefield, but now it carried a note that no hierarch had ever expressed before: uncertainty.
We are eternal.
We are beyond death. We are scared, Captain Chen finished. You're scared.
Good. Now you know how the rest of us feel.
The human fleet struck while their psychological weapon held the hierarch paralyzed by its own rediscovered mortality.
They didn't attack its divine form directly, instead, they targeted the conceptual framework that allowed it to exist as a god. Their weapons weren't firing energy or projectiles, they were firing doubt, fear, and the terrifying knowledge that even immortals could die. Zexhai watched in fascination as the most powerful beings in the galaxy discovered what every mortal species had always known, that existence was fragile, temporary, and precious precisely because it could end. The hierarch's form began to solidify as its divine nature was stripped away layer by layer, revealing something underneath that looked surprisingly vulnerable. How? Zexhai found himself asking. How did you learn to do this?
300 years of losing, Chen replied. The Eternal Dominion is powerful, but they haven't faced real opposition in 50 millennia.
They've forgotten what war actually means. We haven't.
Every human ship lost, every colony burned, every family destroyed, we learned from it all. We studied them, understood them, and figured out how to hurt them where they never expected to be vulnerable. The tactical display showed the hierarch's dreadnought beginning to lose cohesion as its divine commander experienced the full weight of mortality for the first time in thousands of years. Systems that had operated flawlessly since before Earth's sun had formed began to malfunction as the psychological weapon continued its relentless assault on the entity's perception of its own immortality.
Target the dreadnought's power core, Sci-Fi ordered his fleet. While it's distracted, we might actually be able to damage it.
The coalition vessels opened fire, their weapons finally finding purchase against targets that had seemed invulnerable just hours before. Energy beams that had previously been absorbed without effect now carved deep wounds in hulls that had never known damage. The combination of human psychological warfare and conventional firepower was proving devastatingly effective.
But the humans weren't content to simply wound their enemy.
As the coalition fleet pounded the weakened dreadnought, human boarding pods launched from concealment, their organic-looking hulls pulsing with life as they crossed the void. These weren't mechanical landing craft, they were something else entirely, something that registered on sensors as being simultaneously artificial and alive.
Sir, Thralek reported, his voice tight with confusion, those boarding pods are showing life signs.
Multiple species, but the readings are unusual.
Unusual how? Sci-Fi demanded.
They're modified, the communications officer replied.
Genetically, cybernetically, perhaps even psychically. These aren't standard human troops.
The first boarding pod struck the Hierarch's dreadnought and immediately began to burrow through the hull like a living drill. Energy fields that should have vaporized any conventional boarding craft simply parted around it as if recognizing something that belonged there.
Within moments, human forces were inside the most secure vessel in the Dominion fleet. What did they do to themselves?
Vashta whispered. Captain Chan's image flickered on the main screen, and, for the first time, Sci-Fi could see her clearly. Her face bore more than just battle scars, there were technological augmentations seamlessly integrated with biological tissue, creating a fusion of organic and artificial that spoke of modifications far beyond anything the Coalition had attempted. When you're fighting gods, she said simply, sometimes you have to become something more than mortal. The human boarding forces moved through the Dominion dreadnought with a precision that defied explanation. They didn't need maps or guidance systems, they seemed to know instinctively where to go, as if they had inherited genetic memories of every previous boarding action. Their weapons weren't the energy rifles or plasma cannons that most species favored, instead, they carried devices that looked like they had been grown rather than manufactured.
Biological weapons, Sci-Fi realized. They're using biological weapons inside a Dominion vessel. Not just biological, Chen corrected. Evolutionary. Every engagement with the Dominion taught us something new about their vulnerabilities.
We adapted, evolved, changed ourselves to exploit those weaknesses.
What you're seeing isn't just human determination, it's 3 centuries of directed evolution focused on a single goal.
On the tactical display, Sci-Fi could see the human forces spreading through the dreadnought like an infection.
But this wasn't random destruction, they were following specific pathways, targeting precise systems with surgical accuracy.
They had turned ship infiltration into a form of medical procedure, treating Dominion vessels like patients that needed very specific operations. The Hierarch's voice echoed across the battlefield again, but now it carried notes of genuine panic.
Stop. We are divine. We are eternal. You cannot simply. The transmission cut off abruptly as human forces reached the entity's consciousness interface.
For beings who existed primarily as energy constructs housed in technological frameworks, losing access to their ships was like having their bodies amputated.
The Hierarch found itself suddenly, trapped in physical form, experiencing vulnerability for the first time in millennia.
All human vessels, this is Boarding Team Alpha, a new voice came through the comm package secured.
Hierarch is contained and ready for extraction. Extraction? Sci-Fi asked. They're taking it alive?
Information, Chan replied.
Dead gods can't tell you how to kill more gods.
But, a captured Hierarch can provide intelligence on Dominion command structures, fleet movements, technological vulnerabilities.
This isn't just a battle, it's a research expedition. The implications hit Sci-Fi like a physical blow.
The humans weren't just fighting the Eternal Dominion, they were studying them. Every engagement was simultaneously a military action and a scientific experiment, with each captured piece of intelligence making them more effective in future encounters. How long have you been planning this? He asked. Since the day we first encountered them, Chen admitted.
Humans don't just fight wars, we solve problems.
The Eternal Dominion was a problem that required a very specific solution. It just took us 300 years to develop it. The 4th and 5th Dominion dreadnoughts suddenly changed course, breaking away from their formation and accelerating toward the edge of the system. For the first time in recorded history, Dominion forces were retreating from an engagement they could have won through sheer overwhelming force.
Should we pursue? Vashta asked. No, Zexhai replied, studying the tactical readouts. Let them go. Let them carry word back to their empire about what happened here. Why? His lieutenant demanded. Because fear is a weapon too, Zexhai realized, finally, understanding the deeper strategy behind human tactics. They're not just defeating Dominion forces, they're teaching the entire empire to be afraid. When gods start running from mortals, other mortals start wondering if maybe gods aren't as powerful as they pretended to be. The human fleet began to regroup, their ships moving with the same predatory grace they had displayed throughout the engagement. But, now Zexhai could see the cost of their victory. Several human vessels were showing critical damage, their hulls scarred by weapons that could have sterilized planets. Others were missing entirely, their crews having chosen to ram Dominion targets rather than risk their enemies escaping. Casualty report, he found himself asking. 17 human ships destroyed, Chen replied without emotion. 437 crew members dead. Total mission casualties at approximately 12%. The numbers hit Zexhai like a physical blow. In a single engagement, the humans had lost more personnel than most coalition fleets lost in entire campaigns. But, they spoke of it like routine maintenance, as if accepting massive casualties was simply part of their operational doctrine. How can you fight like this? He asked. How can you accept such losses? Because the alternative is worse, Chen replied. Commander, you've been fighting this war with the assumption that you might lose. We've been fighting it with the certainty that we will win, no matter what it costs. When you know victory is inevitable, casualties become acceptable. The confidence in her voice was absolute, unshakable, and, somehow more terrifying than any weapon. The humans weren't just willing to die fighting gods, they genuinely believed they would eventually kill every god in the galaxy. It wasn't hope or determination that drove them, it was mathematical certainty backed by 3 centuries of evolutionary adaptation. Sir, Thralek reported, we're receiving a transmission from Coalition High Command. They're requesting a full debriefing on engagement tactics and human combat capabilities. Tell them they wouldn't believe me if I told them, Zexhai replied. Schedule the debriefing for when we return to base. I have a feeling this war just changed in ways we're only beginning to understand. As the combined human and coalition fleet formed up for the journey home, Zexhai found himself studying the human vessels with new eyes. These weren't just ships, they were weapons designed by a species that had spent centuries learning how to kill things that shouldn't be able to die. Every line of their hull spoke of a design philosophy focused on a single principle: whatever stands against humanity will fall, no matter how powerful, how ancient, or how divine. Captain Chen, he called out, one last question. What happens next? The human commander's scarred face split into something that might have been a smile, though it looked more like the expression of a predator contemplating its next meal. Next, Commander, we teach the rest of the galaxy what we've learned. How to stop being afraid of gods. How to stop accepting that some battles can't be won. How to turn fear into fuel and impossibility into just another problem to solve. She paused, and, when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of human defiance. Next, we show everyone that the only thing gods have that mortals don't is the conviction that they're untouchable. And, we've just proven that even gods can learn to be wrong. As the fleet jumped to hyperspace, Zexhai reflected on everything he had witnessed. In the space of a few hours, he had watched humans kill gods, capture immortal beings, and teach the most powerful empire in the galaxy to experience fear. But, more than that, he had seen what happened when a species decided that the fundamental nature of reality was negotiable. The humans had looked at a universe ruled by gods and decided it needed better management. They were in the process of providing it, one dead hierarch at a time. And, somehow, Zexhai was beginning to think they might actually succeed. 3 days after the engagement that coalition databases would later classify as the first divine mortality event, Commander Zexhai found himself aboard the human flagship Defiant, walking corridors that challenged everything he thought he knew about starship design. The invitation had come from Captain Chen herself, delivered with the casual manner of someone suggesting a tour of a garden rather than offering access to humanity's most closely guarded secrets. The corridors themselves were alive. Not metaphorically, literally. The walls pulsed with a rhythm that matched human heartbeats, and organic conduits carried data streams that registered as neural activity on his sensors. The ship wasn't just built, it had been grown, nurtured, evolved into something that existed at the intersection of biology and technology. Impressive, isn't it? Captain Chen appeared beside him, moving with the silent grace of someone who had been modified for environments where sound meant death. Up close, Zexai could see the extent of her augmentations, neural interfaces that looked like metallic tattoos, cybernetic eyes that probably saw spectrums of light that didn't exist in nature, and something in her movements that suggested her bones had been replaced with materials stronger than anything in the Coalition arsenal. "It's disturbing," Zexai admitted honestly. "Your ship feels like it's watching me." "Because it is," Chen replied with that predatory smile. "The Defiant isn't just my ship, it's my partner. We've been bonded for 15 years now. It knows my thoughts, anticipates my needs, reacts to threats before I'm even consciously aware of them." They passed through a section that opened up into what should have been the ship's central command center, but instead looked more like the inside of a living organism. Crew members moved between control stations that grew from the floor like technological trees, their movements synchronized with the ship's biological rhythms. Some of the humans showed modifications even more extensive than Chen's, individuals who seemed to exist more as interfaces between organic and artificial systems than as traditional biological entities. "How long have you been doing this?" Zexai asked, gesturing at the organic technology surrounding them. "Modifying ourselves to fight gods?" "About 2.5 centuries, Chen replied. "We learned early on that standard military doctrine wasn't going to work against the Eternal Dominion. They had better technology, more experience, and powers that bordered on the supernatural. So we decided to level the playing field by becoming something new." She led him to an observation deck that looked out over the human fleet. From here, Zexai could see the extent of human naval architecture, and it was unlike anything in Coalition databases. Their ships moved in formations that seemed almost organic, responding to commands that appeared to be transmitted through biological networks rather than traditional communications. "Each ship is unique," Chen explained, following his gaze. "We don't mass-produce vessels the way other species do. Instead, we grow them according to their intended role, their expected crew, and their specific mission parameters. The ship and crew co-evolve until they become a single organism designed for a specific purpose. Which is killing gods." The simple honesty of her answer was more chilling than any threat. These weren't fanatics or warriors driven by hatred, they were technicians who had spent centuries developing tools for a very specific job. The emotion in Chen's voice wasn't anger or vengeance, it was professional satisfaction. "Captain," Zexai said carefully, "during the engagement, I witnessed capabilities that shouldn't exist. Psychological weapons that could affect divine consciousness, boarding forces that seemed to know Dominion ship layouts instinctively, biological technology that could interface with their systems. How is any of this possible?" Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with cybernetic eyes that probably saw more about his emotional state than he was comfortable with. "Commander, how much do you know about human history before we encountered the Eternal Dominion?" "The basics. Your species achieved faster than light travel approximately 400 years ago, established first contact with the galactic community 350 years ago, and began your war with the Dominion shortly after." "That's the official timeline," Chen acknowledged. "But it leaves out the important details. Commander, humans didn't just decide to fight gods because we were feeling rebellious. We fought them because we had to. Because they were going to destroy us if we didn't find a way to destroy them first." She activated a holographic display that showed star charts dating back centuries. Zexai could see the expansion of human space, the early colonies, the first encounters with other species. But there was something else in the data patterns that suggested conflicts, losses, entire colonies that simply disappeared from the records. "The Eternal Dominion has a policy," Chen continued. "Any species that shows potential for eventual threat to their hegemony is eliminated before they can become dangerous. When they encountered humanity, they ran their standard analysis and determined that we would eventually develop technologies and philosophies that could challenge their rule." "So they tried to destroy you?" "No," Chen's smile turned cold. "They tried to farm us." The holographic display shifted, showing images that made Zexai's stomach lurch despite his military experience. Human colonies transformed into biological laboratories, entire populations subjected to experiments that defied every convention of warfare. Children modified and shaped into tools, adults used as test subjects for weapons designed to work on species the Dominion hadn't encountered yet. "They kept some of our worlds as testing grounds," Chen explained, her voice steady despite the horrific images playing before them. "For 200 years, they used humanity as a laboratory for developing better methods of control, better weapons of subjugation, better techniques for breaking species that might one day challenge them. How did you escape? We didn't escape, Chen replied. We adapted. Every experiment they performed on us, every modification they made, every weapon they tested, we learned from it. We incorporated their techniques into our own development, turned their tools against them, and used their own research to become something they couldn't control. The tactical implications hit Zexai like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just been fighting the Eternal Dominion for 3 centuries, they had been educated by them. Every biological modification, every technological innovation, every strategic doctrine had been developed in response to direct exposure to Dominion capabilities. The boarding forces, he realized. They knew Dominion ship layouts because we'd been inside Dominion vessels as prisoners, test subjects, and experimental specimens, Chen finished. Every human who was captured provided intelligence. Every colony that was transformed gave us data on their capabilities. Every atrocity they committed taught us something new about how to hurt them. A new crew member approached their position, and Zexai found himself looking at something that challenged his understanding of what constituted a human being. The individual before him showed modifications so extensive that only the basic bipedal form remained recognizably human. Metallic skin seamlessly integrated with biological tissue, multiple arms that ended in tools rather than hands, and sensors where eyes should have been that glowed with their own inner light. Commander Zexai, Chen said, meet technical specialist Reeves. He's one of our Dominion interface experts. Commander, Reeves spoke with a voice that harmonized with itself, as if multiple entities were speaking in perfect synchronization. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to examine genuine coalition technology during our engagement. Your tactical systems provided excellent baseline data for our comparative analysis. You were studying our ships during the battle? Zexai asked. We study everything, Reeves replied. Captain Chen requested this meeting to discuss potential technological integration between our fleets. We believe we can provide significant improvements to coalition combat effectiveness. Chen activated another display, this one showing technical specifications that made Zexai's engineering background rebel against their impossibility. We're prepared to share some of our biological integration techniques with coalition forces. Nothing as extensive as our own modifications, but enough to improve your chances of survival in engagements with Dominion forces. What would be required? Volunteers, Chen replied simply. Crew members willing to undergo modification procedures that will allow them to interface directly with enhanced weapons and defensive systems. The changes aren't reversible, but they're not as extensive as what we've done to ourselves. Zexai studied the technical specifications, his mind racing through the implications. The technologies being offered were decades ahead of anything in coalition databases, but the cost was becoming something other than what his species had evolved to be. Why, he asked. Why offer this to us? Because we're not going to live forever, Chen replied with startling honesty. Despite everything we've done to ourselves, despite all our modifications and enhancements, we're still essentially mortal. The war against the Eternal Dominion is going to take centuries more to complete, and we need allies who can continue the fight if something happens to us. You're planning for your own extinction? We're planning for victory, Reeves corrected, his harmonized voice carrying notes of absolute certainty. Victory requires backup plans, redundant systems, and allies who understand what's at stake. The Eternal Dominion has ruled this galaxy for 50,000 years. They will not be defeated by a single species, no matter how determined. Chen led them to another section of the ship, this one clearly designed for combat training. But the scenarios being practiced bore no resemblance to anything in coalition military doctrine. Human crews were running exercises that involved fighting opponents who could manipulate reality, tactical situations where the enemy could simply wish their weapons out of existence, and combat scenarios that assumed conventional physics didn't apply. This is what we're offering, Chen explained. Not just technology, but understanding. Knowledge of how to fight enemies that exist outside normal parameters, strategies for engaging opponents who don't follow the rules that govern normal warfare, and the tactical doctrine necessary to win battles against entities that consider themselves divine. One of the training scenarios caught Zexai's attention. Human forces were practicing an assault on what appeared to be a hierarch's personal domain, a pocket of controlled space where the entity could reshape reality according to its will. The attacking forces moved with a coordination that suggested they had done this before, many times, using techniques that seemed to turn the hierarch's own power against it. How many of them have you killed? Zexai found himself asking.
47 confirmed, Chen replied without hesitation.
Another dozen probably destroyed but not verified. We estimate there are approximately 300 hierarchs remaining in the Eternal Dominion.
The numbers were staggering. In 3 centuries of warfare, humanity had managed to kill or capture nearly 20% of the entities that ruled the galaxy. It was genocide on a scale that defied comprehension, conducted with the systematic efficiency of an extermination campaign.
How can you maintain this pace of operations? Zexai asked. Evolution, Reeves replied. Every generation of humans is born more capable of fighting gods than the last. We're not just modifying ourselves, we're directing our own evolutionary development toward a single goal. In another century, baseline humans will be capable of feats that currently require extensive augmentation. And, if you succeed? If you actually manage to destroy the Eternal Dominion?
Then, we'll have to decide what to do with a galaxy that no longer has gods to keep it in line, Chen replied.
But, that's a problem for future generations to solve.
Our job is to make sure there are future generations to have that problem. They returned to the observation deck, where Zexai could see coalition vessels moving alongside human ships in formations that were already beginning to show signs of integration. Some of his own crew members were visible through viewports, working alongside human technicians to implement the biological interfaces they had been offered. How many of my people have volunteered for modification? He asked.
30% of your crew, Chen replied. Higher than we expected, actually. Most species are more resistant to biological integration. Why are my people different?
Because they've seen what gods look like when they're afraid, Chen smiled. Once you've witnessed divine fear, it becomes a lot easier to accept that maybe the way things are isn't the way things have to be. The truth of her words settled over Zexai like a weight he hadn't expected. His crew wasn't just volunteering for modification because they wanted better weapons, they were volunteering because they had seen proof that the universe could be changed by beings who refused to accept its limitations. Commander, Chen said, her voice taking on a formal tone, I have an offer to make.
The human fleet is planning a major operation against a Dominion stronghold in the Kepler sector.
Intelligence suggests the presence of at least 3 hierarchs and a significant fleet presence.
We could use coalition support. What kind of operation? Complete sterilization, Chen replied matter-of-factly.
We're going to remove the entire Dominion presence from that sector, capture any hierarchs we can, and use their facilities for our own research purposes.
It's the kind of operation that will send a message to the rest of their empire. Zexai considered the proposal, weighing the tactical advantages against the risks.
Fighting alongside humans had already proven more effective than any previous coalition engagement with Dominion forces. But, committing to a major offensive operation meant accepting that his fleet would be changed forever by the experience.
What would you need from us?
Ships, crew, and the willingness to learn new ways of fighting, Chen replied. In return, we'll share intelligence on Dominion capabilities, provide technological upgrades to your fleet, and teach your people how to kill things that claim to be immortal.
And, if we refuse?
Then, you'll continue fighting the Eternal Dominion the way you always have, Chen shrugged.
Badly, with massive casualties, against an enemy that considers your best efforts to be entertainment. Your choice, Commander.
Zexai looked out at his fleet, seeing ships that had been designed according to principles of conventional warfare, crewed by beings who had been trained to fight enemies that followed logical rules. In the space of a few days, he had learned that the universe contained adversaries who existed outside those rules, and that defeating them required becoming something new. I'll need to consult with Coalition Command, he said.
Of course, Chen replied.
But, Commander, I should mention, time isn't on our side.
The Dominion learns from defeats just like we do. Every day we delay gives them more opportunity to adapt to our capabilities. The window for operations like this one is limited. How limited?
We estimate 6 months before they develop countermeasures for our psychological weapons, Reeves supplied. Perhaps a year before they modify their consciousness architectures to resist biological interface attacks.
The advantages we've gained from this engagement are temporary. Zexai nodded, understanding the tactical pressures involved.
War against gods apparently operated on the same principles as war against anyone else. Use your advantages while you had them, or lose them forever.
I'll send my recommendation to Coalition Command immediately, he promised. Good, Chen smiled. Because Commander, what you've seen so far is just the beginning. If you think killing gods is impressive, Wait until you see what humans can do when we really put our minds to it. As Zexai prepared to return to his own ship, he found himself wondering what other impossible things the humans were preparing to accomplish. If this was their idea of a routine engagement, what would they consider a major operation? He was afraid he was about to find out. 6 weeks after Commander Zexai's meeting aboard the Defiant, the combined human coalition fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler sector, and Zexai immediately understood why humans referred to their enemies as gods. The Dominion stronghold before them wasn't just a military installation, it was a monument to power so absolute that it had reshaped the fundamental nature of local spacetime. The facility hung in the void like a crystal cathedral the size of a small moon, its faceted surfaces reflecting light that existed in spectrums beyond normal physics. Energy patterns flowed through its structure in ways that made coalition sensors emit confused error messages, and the space around it rippled with gravitational anomalies that suggested the presence of entities capable of casually violating the laws of reality. Tactical analysis, Zexai requested, though he suspected his instruments would be as confused as he was. Sir, Lieutenant Vashta replied, her voice tight with the strain of processing impossible data, the readings are inconsistent. The structure appears to be simultaneously present in normal space and several other dimensional frameworks. Mass estimates range from negligible to approximately 3 times that of our home star, depending on which sensor array we use. Translation: Commander Chen's voice came through the enhanced communication systems that human technicians had integrated into coalition vessels. The hierarchs have been using this place long enough to turn it into their personal reality. Normal physics don't apply within approximately 10 million kilometers of the facility. Zexai studied the tactical display, watching as it struggled to represent something that existed according to rules his species had never encountered. The human modifications to his ship's systems were providing data that conventional sensors couldn't detect, revealing layers of reality that normal beings weren't supposed to perceive. How do we attack something that exists outside normal spacetime? He asked. Very carefully, Chen replied, her tone carrying the satisfaction of someone about to demonstrate expertise gained through centuries of practice. And, with weapons designed specifically for this purpose. The human fleet was already moving into formation, but their arrangement bore no resemblance to any tactical doctrine in coalition databases. Instead of forming defensive lines or attack formations, the ships were positioning themselves according to patterns that looked almost ritualistic. Some vessels were connecting to others through organic conduits that grew between hulls like biological bridges, creating linked networks of ships that functioned as single organisms. Sir, technical specialist Vashta called out, her voice carrying a note of wonder, the human vessels are sharing more than tactical data. They're linking their consciousness networks. The crews of multiple ships are thinking as one entity. Zexai watched in fascination as the process unfolded. Human ships that had been individual units moments before were now functioning as organs in a larger body, their crews enhanced neural interfaces allowing them to share thoughts, reactions, and tactical assessments in real time. The entire human fleet was becoming a single organism designed for one purpose, destroying things that claimed to exist beyond the reach of normal weapons. All coalition vessels, Chen's voice came through the calm, prepare for consciousness integration. Your modified crew members will serve as interface nodes. Across Zexai's fleet, the crew members who had volunteered for human biological modifications suddenly stiffened as their new neural interfaces activated. Their eyes took on the same glow that he had seen in fully modified humans, and, when they spoke, their voices carried harmonics that suggested they were accessing information from sources beyond their individual minds. Sir, one of his modified officers reported, her voice carrying notes that belonged to multiple speakers, were receiving tactical integration data from the human network. Enemy analysis, attack vectors, and psychological warfare protocols are being shared across all participating vessels. What are we looking at? Zexai asked, studying the data streams flowing between ships. A type of engagement that most species consider impossible, the officer replied. We're not just attacking a Dominion facility, we're attacking the conceptual framework that allows it to exist. The hierarchs have spent millennia turning this place into their personal domain, but that also means its existence depends on their consciousness. Disrupt their perception of reality, and the entire structure becomes vulnerable. The tactical display suddenly shifted as human analytical networks processed the target in ways that coalition computers couldn't match. The impossible cathedral resolved into something that made sense from a warfare perspective, a fortress designed by beings who had never conceived of enemies capable of attacking their fundamental assumptions about existence. Target identified, Chen announced. 3 hierarchs confirmed present, designated as Eternal Glory, Infinite Wisdom, and Undying Majesty. Standard protocol indicates they've been in residence long enough to achieve deep reality integration with the facility. What does that mean? Zexai asked.
It means they become part of the structure itself, his modified officer explained, her voice now carrying definite harmonics from the human consciousness network.
Their personal existence is intertwined with the facility's dimensional framework. Destroying the installation means killing them, and killing them means collapsing the installation.
The human fleet suddenly accelerated, their ships moving with predatory grace toward targets that most species would have been unable to even perceive properly. But, as they approached the facility, something unexpected happened. The space around them began to change. Reality itself started to reshape according to the will of the entities defending their stronghold. Zexai watched in horror as the laws of physics simply stopped applying in certain areas. Human ships found themselves flying through regions where gravity flowed upward, where light traveled in spirals, where time itself moved at different speeds depending on location. The hierarchs were using their control over local reality as a weapon, trying to trap their attackers in zones where normal technology couldn't function.
But, the humans had apparently encountered this before.
Their ships adapted to each new reality zone as they entered it, their biological components shifting to accommodate conditions that would have destroyed conventional vessels. Crews that had been modified to interface with impossible technologies found themselves capable of operating in impossible environments.
How? Zexai demanded. How are they functioning in zones where physics don't work?
Because they've learned to think like gods, his modified officer replied.
When reality becomes subjective, survival depends on will rather than technology.
The human consciousness network is imposing its own perception of reality on the local environment, creating stable zones where their ships can operate normally.
The concept was so fundamentally alien that Zexai's mind initially rejected it.
The idea that consciousness could override physical law was the kind of thing that belonged in religious texts, not tactical manuals. But, he was watching it happen. Human ships were literally thinking their way through reality zones that should have been impassable. The first human boarding pods launched toward the Dominion facility, but these weren't the organic craft he had seen before. These looked like living weapons, their hulls pulsing with energy patterns that suggested they existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that his sensors couldn't detect. They moved through the reality-distorted zones around the facility as if such conditions were their natural environment.
What are those things? Vashta asked. Dimensional assault craft, the modified officer explained. Designed to operate in environments where normal physics have been suspended. The crews are extensively modified. How extensively?
They're not entirely human anymore, came the honest reply. Extensive neural enhancement, dimensional perception augmentation, and consciousness integration with craft AI systems.
They exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional frameworks.
The implications hit Zexai with the force of revelation. The humans weren't just modifying their technology to fight gods, they were modifying themselves until they were capable of existing in the same dimensional spaces as their enemies.
They were becoming something that could meet divine entities on equal terms.
The assault craft struck the facility's surface and immediately began burrowing through barriers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But, instead of the conventional drilling he had expected, the craft seemed to phase through the structure's defenses, as if they were accessing weak points that existed in realities parallel to normal space. Sir, the tactical officer reported, her voice now definitely carrying harmonics from multiple consciousness networks, boarding forces have achieved dimensional penetration. They're encountering hierarch defensive constructs. The main screen flickered to life with images that made every unmodified member of Zexai's crew step backward instinctively. The boarding teams were fighting their way through corridors that redefined themselves with each step, engaging enemies that existed as pure energy given malevolent intent. The human assault forces moved through environments that would have driven normal beings insane, using weapons that seemed to function by convincing reality that different rules applied.
Impossible, Zexai whispered.
No, his modified officer corrected, just very difficult.
The humans have been practicing this kind of warfare for decades.
They've developed techniques for fighting in environments where the enemy can control fundamental physical laws. One of the boarding teams reached what appeared to be a central chamber, and, suddenly, Zexai found himself looking at something that challenged his understanding of existence itself. The hierarch called Eternal Glory stood before the human assault force, its form shifting between states of matter as it drew power from the dimensional framework that surrounded them.
But the humans weren't intimidated. Their leader, so heavily modified that determining their original species was impossible, approached the divine entity with weapons that looked like they had been grown rather than manufactured. The engagement that followed wasn't combat in any conventional sense, it was a contest between different interpretations of what reality should look like. "What are they doing?" HFY demanded. "Consciousness warfare," his officer explained. "The hierarch is trying to impose its will on local reality. The human team is using collective consciousness techniques to counter those impositions. Essentially, they're arguing with a god about the fundamental nature of existence." The battle unfolded across multiple dimensions simultaneously, with the human team using their enhanced neural networks to coordinate reality alterations that counteracted the hierarch's attempts to reshape the environment. It was like watching theology in reverse. Instead of mortals praying to gods, humans were forcing a god to accept their version of how things should work. The moment when Eternal Glory realized it was losing was visible even through the dimensional distortions. The entity's perfect form flickered with something that might have been uncertainty, and, suddenly, the entire facility began to destabilize as its primary consciousness anchor lost confidence in its own omnipotence. "Target down," came the report from the boarding team. "Eternal Glory has been contained and is ready for extraction." "Contained?" HFY asked. "Captured alive," his officer confirmed. "The humans have developed techniques for imprisoning divine consciousness in portable containment units. They're building a collection." The tactical implications were staggering. The humans weren't just killing gods, they were capturing them, studying them, and, presumably using the knowledge gained to become more effective god killers. It was the kind of systematic approach to warfare that could only come from a species that had turned deicide into a science. The second and third hierarchs attempted to withdraw deeper into the facility, but the human assault teams were already moving to intercept them. Their movements through the dimensional labyrinth showed a familiarity that suggested they had practiced this specific type of operation many times before. "How many of these facilities have they assaulted?" HFY asked. "This is the 43rd confirmed dimensional stronghold penetration," his officer replied. "The humans have developed the assault into a standard operational procedure. They expect to clear the remaining hierarchs within 6 hours. 6 hours. The humans were planning to completely neutralize a facility that had taken gods millennia to construct, and they were treating it like routine maintenance. The casual efficiency was more impressive than any display of raw power. "Sir," Vashta called out, "Coalition Command is requesting immediate debriefing on human capabilities. They're concerned about the implications of what we're witnessing." HFY could understand their concern. In the space of a few months, humanity had demonstrated capabilities that redefined what was possible in warfare. They had shown that gods could be killed, captured, and studied. They had proven that reality itself was negotiable when approached with sufficient determination and the right modifications. Most troubling of all, they had made it look easy. "What happens after they clear this facility?" he asked. "Standard procedure is to convert it into a human research station," his officer replied. "They'll study the dimensional manipulation techniques the hierarchs used, integrate useful technologies into their own systems, and use the facility as a staging area for operations against additional Dominion strongholds." They're not just defeating the Eternal Dominion, HFY realized. They're replacing them. Yes, his officer confirmed with disturbing calm. The humans appear to be conducting a systematic campaign to assume control of Dominion territories, technologies, and capabilities. They're not just winning a war, they're inheriting an empire. The final hierarch fell 4 hours and 17 minutes after the assault began, its consciousness captured and contained like the others. The facility itself underwent a transformation that was visible even from the coalition fleet's position, its crystalline structure reshaping itself according to human specifications. In the space of a few hours, a monument to divine power had become a human research installation. "All vessels," Chen's voice came through the calm, carrying satisfaction and, something else, anticipation. "Operation complete. Kepler's sector is now under human control. All hierarchs captured, facility converted, local reality stabilized according to standard parameters. What's next?" HFY found himself asking. "Next, Commander, we move on to the Vega cluster. Intelligence indicates the presence of a Dominion fleet base with at least 7 hierarchs. Should be interesting. 7 hierarchs. The humans were talking about engaging 7 divine entities simultaneously, and they made it sound like an interesting challenge rather than an impossible mission. Zexhai was beginning to understand that his species' concept of impossible apparently didn't apply to humans. Coalition fleet will need time to refit and resupply, he replied. Of course, Chen agreed. We'll spend the next few weeks upgrading your ships with dimensional warfare capabilities. Some of your crew will need additional modifications to handle the enhanced systems. How extensive? Nothing too radical, Chen assured him. Just enough to let them survive in combat zones where normal physics don't apply. Standard godfighting modifications. Standard godfighting modifications. The phrase would have been incomprehensible 6 months ago. Now it was apparently routine operational terminology. As the combined fleet formed up for the journey to their new base of operations, Zexhai reflected on how much his understanding of warfare had changed. 6 months ago, he had been fighting a conventional war against an overwhelming enemy. Now he was part of a campaign to systematically dismantle divine power itself, conducted by allies who had turned the impossible into standard operating procedure. Sir, his modified officer said, her voice carrying harmonics from the human consciousness network, the humans are transmitting educational materials on advanced godfighting techniques. Should I distribute them to the crew? Advanced godfighting techniques. Educational materials on killing immortal beings. Standard procedure for capturing entities that existed outside normal reality. Yes, Zexhai replied. Distribute them. If we're going to fight gods, we might as well learn how to do it properly. As the fleet jumped to hyperspace, he wondered what other impossible things the humans would teach him to consider routine. So far, they had made him comfortable with deicide, dimensional warfare, and reality manipulation. What would be next? He was afraid he was about to find out. 1 year after his first encounter with human warfare, Commander Zexhai stood on the observation deck of his flagship and contemplated the view outside. The stars looked different now, not because they had physically changed, but because he understood what existed between them. Where once he had seen empty space, he now perceived the dimensional frameworks that connected reality, the consciousness networks that bound enhanced crews together, and the probability streams that determined where gods might try to hide. His ship itself had changed beyond recognition. The coalition vessel that had once relied on conventional technology now pulsed with organic conduits, responded to thought as much as command input, and existed simultaneously in multiple dimensional states. More importantly, his crew had changed. Over 70% of them now bore modifications that would have been considered impossible a year ago, and they moved through their duties with the coordinated precision of a collective intelligence. Sir, Lieutenant Vashta approached, her appearance so altered that only her voice identified her as the same being who had served on his bridge during that first engagement with human forces. Her scales had been replaced with adaptive biosynthetic armor, her eyes now saw across dimensional spectrums that didn't exist in nature, and her movements carried the fluid grace of someone whose nervous system had been enhanced beyond normal biological limits. Report, Lieutenant. Intelligence from the human reconnaissance networks indicates that the Eternal Dominion has begun emergency protocols, she said, her voice carrying harmonics from the consciousness mesh that connected all modified coalition personnel. They're consolidating their remaining forces around their primary stronghold in the galactic core. Zexhai accessed the tactical data through his own neural interface, feeling information flow directly into his consciousness rather than requiring him to read displays or hear reports. The sensation had been disturbing initially, but he had grown to appreciate the efficiency of direct neural data transfer. Thoughts and analysis could be shared instantly across the entire fleet, creating a collective intelligence that was greater than the sum of its parts. The information he accessed was staggering in its implications. Over the past year, the combined human coalition force had systematically dismantled the Eternal Dominion's network of strongholds, research facilities, and fleet bases. 47 more divine entities had been captured or destroyed, entire sectors had been liberated from Dominion control, and hundreds of previously subjugated species had been freed from divine oppression. But the cost had been substantial. The modifications necessary to fight gods had changed everyone involved in ways that couldn't be undone. Coalition forces that had once been recognizably members of their original species now bore alterations that placed them somewhere between their natural forms and humanity's engineered perfection. They were more capable, more intelligent, more adaptable, but they were no longer entirely what they had been. Casualty assessment? Zexhai asked, though he already knew the numbers would be difficult to categorize. How did you count casualties when death itself had become a negotiable concept? Conventional fatalities are at approximately 8%, Vashta replied. However, consciousness integration casualties are more significant. Roughly 30% of modified personnel have undergone identity merger with the collective network. They're still alive? There's something new, she explained. Their individual consciousness has been absorbed into the larger network, but their memories, skills, and personalities remain accessible to the collective. They exist as facets of a larger intelligence rather than as separate entities. The concept would have horrified him a year ago. Now, Zexai found himself envying those who had achieved complete integration with the consciousness network. The glimpses of collective thought he experienced through his own modifications suggested an existence free from the limitations and loneliness that define individual consciousness. Sir, Communications Officer Thralek approached, his modifications even more extensive than Vashta's. His original species' tentacled form had been enhanced with technological integration that allowed him to interface directly with any system in the ship, and his consciousness existed partially in digital space even when he was physically present. Captain Chen is requesting your presence aboard the Defiant. She says it's time for the final briefing. Zexai nodded, accessing the transport protocols through his neural link. Within moments, he found himself standing in the central command chamber of the human flagship, surrounded by beings that challenged every definition of what constituted life, intelligence, and individual existence. Captain Chen herself had undergone modifications so extensive that calling her human required a very flexible interpretation of the term. Her form shifted between physical and digital states as needed, her consciousness existed simultaneously across multiple dimensional frameworks, and her integration with the ship's biological systems was so complete that determining where she ended and the vessel began was impossible. Commander, she greeted him, her voice carrying harmonics from every enhanced crew member in the fleet. Welcome to the final phase. Final phase? The Eternal Dominion has retreated to their core stronghold, Chen explained, activating displays that showed the galactic center in detail that was both tactical and metaphysical. Everything we've done for the past year has been preparation for this moment. We're going to assault the heart of divine power in this galaxy. The target that appeared on the displays was unlike anything Zexai had encountered in his previous engagements with Dominion forces. The core stronghold wasn't just a facility or a fleet base, it was an entire region of space where the hierarchs had spent 50,000 years reshaping reality according to their will. Stars burned with colors that didn't exist in normal physics, planets orbited according to mathematical principles that defied conventional astronomy, and space itself was structured according to divine aesthetics rather than natural law. How many hierarchs are we looking at? Zexai asked. Approximately 230, Chen replied with the casual tone of someone discussing routine maintenance requirements. Plus whatever reinforcements they've managed to summon from their extra-dimensional territories. 230 divine entities, Zexai repeated, trying to process the magnitude of what was being proposed. How is such an assault even possible? Because we're not the same species that started this war, Chen smiled, her expression carrying satisfaction from thousands of modified consciousness networks. Commander, look around this chamber. Tell me what you see. Zexai studied the beings surrounding him, applying his enhanced perception to analyze what they had become. The chamber contained representatives from dozens of species, all modified to varying degrees, all connected through biological and technological networks that enabled them to function as a single organism when necessary. But, more than that, they moved with a coordination and purpose that spoke of shared goals and unified consciousness. I see an army that thinks like a god, he realized. Exactly, Chen confirmed. The Eternal Dominion's greatest strength was their unity of purpose and their ability to coordinate actions across vast scales of space and time. We've learned to replicate those advantages while maintaining the adaptability and innovation that comes from diversity. The tactical briefing that followed was unlike anything in conventional military doctrine. Instead of discussing ship movements and weapon deployments, Chen outlined strategies for reality warfare, consciousness integration protocols, and techniques for imposing human perceptions of physics on regions where the hierarchs had been free to indulge their divine whims for millennia. Phase 1 involves dimensional infiltration, Chen explained, showing attack patterns that existed in mathematical spaces beyond normal geometry. We'll use consciousness projection techniques to establish beachheads in their reality framework before bringing our ships through. Phase 2 is psychological warfare on a galactic scale, technical specialist Reeves added, his form now so extensively modified that he existed more as a living interface between biological and digital systems than as an individual entity.
We'll use the captured hierarchs to broadcast doubt and mortality awareness.